software. I hate. Hey everyone from Facebook and Music Direct, musicdirect.com. It's Bess and Vera from Music Direct. How are you? I hope you are doing well today, wherever you may be around the world. And hey, here's me. We hope you've been enjoying these programs known as Conversations from the Listening Room. We've been getting a lot of great press from both our customers and our industry friends who have chimed in and said, what a great hour to spend with a lot of people that we know and some that we want to know. And it's really been a privilege to enjoy that. As always, with anything that you hear or know or want to know about products that are being discussed here at Music Direct's Facebook site, it's all available on our Music Direct webpage, musicdirect.com. You can also contact our team anytime at 1-800-449-8333 during normal business hours, of course, and they'll be more than happy to answer your questions and help you purchase those great products. Also, one last thing, if you haven't already done so, Soundbites. That's our weekly emailer that gives you an idea of what's going on. You'll also get links to our latest column that's written and curated by my colleague Josh Bizarre that basically started this whole business, Notes from My Listening Room. And that's a really wonderful deep dive in the music and the equipment that we've all listened to growing up or just living with through these unique times here in the United States. So that's all available for you when you visit our website at musicdirect.com. Well, today is a very nice day for a great long conversation with our next guest. William Lowe is the founder and CEO of the Quest Group, parent company of AudioQuest and GoldenEar. William, better known as Bill, likes to say he never had a business plan, only wanted to be self-employed, and for that living, breathing, and eating hi-fi was simply the world he knew. Suffice it to say that Bill's clear vision has worked out well. The organic evolution of his career, from creating his first two cables in the late 1970s to founding AudioQuest in 1980 to overseeing one of high-end audio's premier companies, has been nothing if not organic. For more than 4 decades, he's remained guided by the same basic principles, all related to how a business should continually earn its right to exist. Indeed, Bill has always decided that the weakness inherent in companies whose distribution message does not parallel their message to customers, as a lifelong consumer himself, as well as a former appointment-only retailer, Bill only knows how to think of such needs and desires as being the same. And I am very pleased to welcome Bill Lowe from California to join us today. Sir, how are you?
Very good. Thank you, Bess.
Good to see you. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. I know that you've had a pretty busy morning of meetings and so forth, showing that the world of AudioQuest is still clicking away. But to begin, of course, the opening question, given the recent pandemic and how it's sort of making its way through our world, is how are you? How is AudioQuest in general? And how are things going forward with the organization as we know it?
I'm fond of saying that life and certainly business are works in progress. Progress meaning that they're always moving, and you're either being washed downstream or you are doing something productive to take control of your destiny. So in that sense, there's no difference. But March was traumatic and dramatic as California closed down and as retail took a giant, hold its breath. But in the meantime, it's turned out that our side of retail business, I think Music Direct can speak to this as more directly than I can, that people are at home and they need hi-fi. And the majority of the people we do business with are really doing quite well, or certainly as we see in terms of their needing product from us. Mass market, we are also in 1,100 Best Buy stores and 120 cons, and Dish goes out and does 23,000 installations a day and recommending AudioQuest along the way. That's a lot of business to have hold its breath for months at a time. So we don't know, where it'll all come out for what it takes to remain profitable, but we're adapting. And incredibly productively energized that we are better. We're going to be a better company. We are becoming a better company every day at a faster rate than normal. This is an acceleration into the future for all of us. Macroeconomic turbulence always does that. People who wait for the past to return, it never does. Uh, these are the conditions that accelerate either markets expanding or shrinking. Whatever it is they're doing, they're going to come back smaller or bigger, depending on what they were going to do anyway.
Right.
And are you prepared for it? Anyway, the short answer is we're having the time of my life.
That, in fact, is the correct answer. But of course, it's good to see you healthy. Certainly, we obviously worry for people who may be affected by this, and we want everybody to do what they can to recover and to be safe during this important time. And many of our customers, as you have so rightly pointed out, they're busy. We are incredibly busy given the stature of how we've had to adjust our model, most notably with social distancing within our main areas of our office, within our warehouse. Our sales teams are currently separated. I'm reporting from home, thankfully with a good internet signal. But also at the same time, I'm also doubling my efforts by going into the office and doing things where certain projects require my call, namely that of setting up turntables and doing more internal things that call for my fingerprint in the day-to-day operation. So I'm deeply grateful for that responsibility too. So I got to say, I look back at the time, it's almost equal to when you really were jumping into this business. When I first started out in this industry in 1981, I think we were still at a point where I was handing out lamp cord to people. Pieces of equipment in those days were not with separate power cords or varying degrees of componentry. It was just thrown in the box, ready to go. So whether it was that Sony receiver, that Hitachi tape deck, or other products with a pair of, say, Advent Smalls or house-branded speakers, because I started my career at Pacific Stereo, so we mentioned it at the onset about Quadraflex, and you'd throw them a roll of 16-gauge speaker wire, strip them, boom, go, go, go. Enter you and the story on how you have basically rewritten the rules on why these things matter. And I want to start by asking you what drove you to want to open a hi-fi store before AudioQuest. Where was the DNA for that? What was going on in your mind when you began your career?
Well, the first hi-fi store in 1973 was while I was a student at Reed College, and that I rented two apartments across the street from campus, one that I lived in and one that was the Greenwood Sound showroom. But that was only an extension of how in high school I built Dynakits and Heath kits for people for $5-10 a piece, because I was at a school where that's how much those kids had as weekly allowance, and I had 50 cents, and making up the difference so I could buy records and used hi-fi gear, that incremental, wherever it is you start, that's where you start. As a 13-year-old, pouring through the Lafayette and Radio Shack and Allied. Radio Shack was a different Boston-based company in those days, but the Allied and Lafayette catalogs, buying $1 speakers that went in $1 cabinets, of which I strung 7 of them around my little dorm room, creating an immersive sound effect from my mono Sony radio and my mono little 3¼ inch, reel-to-reel tape recorder. My life musically was, AM, well, FM, WBCN at the time, and not BCN. That came later. Anyway, popular radio before FM actually began to change the landscape, and eventually BCM in Boston, which started after midnight doing album-oriented progressive, and the Hendrixes and the Doors and that part of the world became visible compared to.
So you were like me, listening to AM, the little 2-minute, 3-minute ditty, and a lot of commercials.
It's when I was in 5th grade doing my homework in suburbs of New York City, I kept a little $7 transistor radio in each of the left and right drawers, which I then had open about 4 inches. Again, this was an attempt to create a dispersed audio field. Now I look at something like a Bose 901, which I'm not sure how many people even remember, as a phase distortion generator, and what a horrible thing it is to be bouncing, incoherent sound off the walls. But we should never forget, we should never lose in our heart what it was that first impressed us, which was being immersed in a sound field and getting away from the awareness of a low quality point source seemed to be a priority at the time.
Yeah, no question about that. You said you transitioned over to BCN, FM progressive radio and the long form album tracks. Can you recall a time when one of your favorite tracks was on the air, and how that worked in play in the subject of immersion and the speakers that and the systems that you built around yourself?
Well, I've forgotten exactly what lights out time was at the dorm that I was living in Middlesex School out in Concord, Mass. But when WBCN went from playing, I think, classical during the day to becoming this alternative community, the Fort Hill community, Roxbury, and advertising were the hip clothing stores in Harvard Square and that type of thing, only happened after midnight. So it was illegal that I would have been listening at all, as was true for me back in third grade, listening to 1010 Winds, Murray McKay, in New York City on an earbud, under the pillow when I was supposed to be asleep, at home. It's all a natural, organic evolution. There aren't really, you can pick moments along the way, but either you are part of the 90% of humanity, it's not 100, that simply finds music compelling. Not all music. Music is provocative, and you can hate it as much as you can love it. And we all have different sort of home turf, and then willingness to, or flexibility to enjoy music that's not our type, more likely when it's live. There's music I listen to live, I never listen to at home. I subscribe to the Metropolitan Opera in New York. I never listen to opera outside of that context, or the Royal Opera in London gets me too. The event status, the sense of occasion that I will devote myself to allowing this other influence to take me over. I think that's common to all of us, even if the particulars of the music and how we talk about our relationship is sometimes seems more disparate than it actually is. The genetic code is the same for all of us. We're really sharing something very similar.
So in a way, when you look back at those days when music began to really become very influential, you looked at it from a full plate of stuff.
I didn't look at it. It washed over me. I think people rewrite history, and I've seen other manufacturers rewrite their history, and I said, no, I know you. That's not how it worked. we reverse, hindsight. We create this. Well, that's what I must have been thinking in order to have done that thing. Most thinking is subconscious. The last part of our biology, our physiological self that knows anything, is our consciousness. Yes, we do direct our activity through conscious decisions, but we are pawns. We are pawns to our body. We are pawns to culture. And I rode a wave of baby boomer music that took on an unprecedented level, where recorded music took on an unprecedented level of societal significance, whether it was, songs like Eve of Destruction. I mean, most songs are just about how I want to get laid, I want to get laid, I want to get laid. And how many ways can you say that, like 96 Tears or something? And the blues were saying that in ways that not everybody still yet catches what the meaning is of that chair and that whatever it is in that song. Those themes do not change. But there was a societal change. Transistors were part of it. The economics of post-World War II were part of it. There's a certain irony that music was taken to an unprecedented level of social significance, along with the rise of TV. That it's the TV generation who are the ones that created this nostalgic, oh, everybody had a hi-fi, everybody wanted to have a hi-fi, you worked at Pacific Stereo. That anybody who had any interest could open a hi-fi store on the corner, and no matter how stupid they were at business and whatever they carried, they had some customers because people wanted. I think John Kellogg, when he was at Dolby, made a comment about Working at a hi-fi store was the closest thing to playing in a rock and roll band. Everybody wanted to be your friend, get some inside information and know something. Uh, that culture peaked in about 1978. Uh, Hi-fi is healthier today than it's ever been in many ways, but people don't always read the symptoms correctly. Like somebody moves to Los Angeles and it doesn't snow, they say, oh, there are no seasons. No, you live in Los Angeles. There are about 8 different seasons, 4 of which can happen any given time of year. It's a different language, but that doesn't mean there are no seasons. Uh, so when we take the way we look at things today and create a nostalgic sort of Planet of the Apes kind of misreading of the heyday of audio, no, it's not the same world. But that it was a thrill ride, as much of the world that we now take for granted was being invented.
That's cool. Let's go a little bit forward now and talk about AudioQuest as it develops, as it grows as a company. Uh, how when AudioQuest began marketing its products for the first time in the early '80s, how did the industry react to this concept of maximizing performance of a simple component through the use of cables? Why was that such a polarizing point for you at that time?
Well, again, it's a symptom rather than itself, and the larger initiative. So cable became a subject to me in the U.S. audio industry in June of 1976 when Polk Audio introduced what they call Cobra cable, Japanese imported cable. Specialty audio wasn't even part of CS in those days. It was an informal gathering of more fanatical. By fanatical, it doesn't mean high-end the way we mean it today with expensive gear, but just caring about the edge, what I prefer in marketing terms to refer to as merit-based marketing. Listen to this, and if you like it, sell it in your store. Write about it if you're a reviewer, buy it if you're a consumer. So 1976, Polk shot the starting gun. That doesn't mean it was the first cable, absolutely, but it certainly was the visible cable to those of us who cared. So no, it wasn't like what Monster Cable started in 1979. Monster did more to teach dealers, cajole, beat, whatever the relationships were. Noel was a magician to get dealers to carry cable. The fact that cable wasn't nearly as good as the electrical cable that Noel started selling in 1977 wasn't really the point. The point was that compared to the 22 gauge zip cord that came in the box with your speakers, a 12 gauge 259 strand per side cable was a gigantic improvement, even if you could buy better cable at the hardware store for half the money. The point is the message, the awareness, which gets back to your question, was fundamental. Well, I don't see myself as creating awareness. The credit for that goes to people like QED with QED 79 and Monster and a few other companies around the world who really took it to the streets, to the retailer in a way that was much broader than what I did. When early 1980s, I would do cross-country drives and go to a phone booth in Dayton, Ohio, and take out the phone book and see who the dealer was in town who carried the better lines. It was usually Yamaha, ADS, B&O, Macintosh in those days. I would cold call on that dealer, and usually within 20 minutes, I was what today we call a shared listening evaluation. I was listening with the manager of that store to a cable, and they would hear a difference, and they'd be like, wow, I can sell this. And I'd have a dealer. Before I went to my first CES and exhibited, at my first CES in January of 1981, I had 42 dealers in Southern California because I had been a failed manufacturer's representative in Southern California. So I knew everybody, even if I had to sell everything I owned to pay the rent. And one dealer in Denver, because on the way back from the 1980 June show, the last show I didn't exhibit at, I'd taken delivery of the first couple of spools of cable that were not for the sake of my little store. That started in 1978. And I stopped in Denver, and I stopped at Listen Up on a Saturday afternoon. And Walt Stinson used to have his office right at the front of the store, like he was the greeter. And I told him what I was doing, and he wrote me a check for 2 spools of cable. And Listen Up has been a dealer ever since. So
Is it safe to say that they're the oldest dealer in the country at this point? For having
no, I already had dozens of dealers in Southern California. They were the oldest outside of Southern California.
Okay.
But then when I exhibited in January of '81, within 2 months of my exhibiting for the first time at CES, I had dealers in 35 states and 19 countries. Now, that was not a result of my marketing. That was a result of hunger on the part of the market. So I was a symptom. I do not get credit for being a driver. That I made a better product than somebody else and earned a position. Okay, I'll take some credit for that. But most of us who sometimes get mythologized in some small way as having invented this or having done this thing that we changed the world. No, we were just the ones who were a little better at responding to the ecology that we were simply part of in the air we breathed. We did not invent that air.
Well,
We rode a cultural wave. I'm fond of saying that the audio industry is a tail wagged by a much bigger cultural dog. We really have no influence over it. The vinyl revolution today is a Hollywood creation.
I hear
It
you.
is not about audiophiles.
I hear you. So let's put this into a different perspective then, if I can. As AudioQuest has matured, so too have been a number of technologies and concepts that have been ingrained, certainly in my brain for as long as I've been employed with Music Direct, coming up on 25 years in August, but also in part to your dynamic team of people who come to our office or do of late plenty of video conferencing to discuss the line. And the operative word here that I want to talk about, or the operative phrase that I want to talk about here, is simply do no harm. And that's been kind of the premise for a lot of the products, from all the entry-level cables that I used to sell when I first joined with Music Direct, such as the Lapis, or well, I shouldn't say entry-level, but any cable, like Lapis, Emerald, and going up today to the latest DBS technologies, the introduction of the Niagara line of power cords and line conditioners. How, the, the, the thought of that always stayed foremost in my mind. Why do you think "do no harm" is such a critical phrase that we need to maintain in our heads these days?
Well, it's a nice little 3 words that resonates with something that people have heard elsewhere. Like when people ask where I get the names for the cable, or where I get the names for cables is one thing, but why do I use names and pictures? Because they bring energy. It's the way language works. They bring energy from a different application into our application. So do no harm is thousands of years old as a general idea that's particularly pertinent to cable, because cable can't make, well, with minor exceptions like the ground noise dissipation circuit that's part of the base cables and our power cables today. But for the most part, cable can only make the signal worse. And so I resist the sales language, the rah rah go go Kirby vacuum cleaner version of sales that only knows how to talk in terms of positives. So yes, buying a better cable means that better sound comes out of your system, and to some extent that allows you to get high on music a little more easily, or the predictability, it's more predictable, more accessible, more available to have that immersive experience. So there is positive side to why one should want to have a good cable, but understanding cable itself is not a question of understanding what it does right. It's a question of understanding what it does wrong. Now, nobody needs to know that, but partly because we're a predominantly male audience and it's not exclusive to males, I don't want to make inappropriate generalizations, but the fondness for rationalizing and the human proclivity to create what I call operative assumptions, we think we want to understand everything. So we invent cultures, we invent many phenomena to make us more comfortable about the world, because we can pretend that we understand it when half of what we think we understand is wrong, but the crutches still do their job. So in that sense, it's genetically appropriate that we have this absolute destiny inside us that we want to understand. And actual understanding, unfortunately, often gets suppressed by the stories that are easier to tell or market. So
I mean, there's so many.
marketing a negative is pretty hard.
Yes.
But do no harm is a codification for the phenomenon that if you actually want to know what's going on, it's about less harm, not about, I got 20 million more pixels than you've got, and I've got a higher sampling rate than you've got, and I've got more power than you've got. And all of those things get carried to extremes that are also counterproductive, where you get lower quality as a result of too many pixels, and lower quality as a result of higher sampling rates. That's not always true,
Mm.
but treating it as a goal by itself rather than in context, yes, higher sampling rates have more noise and they're worse. Uh, if you treat it as an infinite goal, it's not. The balance is compromise. And again, compromise isn't what people like to hear, but any good designer of any product has to be 100% as aware of what they didn't do, what they couldn't do, what they couldn't afford to do. That if they did this, it meant this other quality would have been reduced, and how they balance those. Balance. Not ever have no. The perfection is not possible.
Yeah, I hear you. Which brings sort of circle to another part of the question that you basically alluded to earlier. Um, you always seem to have a lot of fun when it comes to naming products. You mentioned that a little bit earlier. So I want to kind of see where those influences are. Why would we want to give something yeah, an Earth name? Why would we want to give it the name of an animal? And so on and so forth. Why couldn't we just call it model number one? That kind of thought. What's the thinking behind that?
Um, it started pretty organically. In the early days, it was just sort of colors. In fact, the first cable was Livewire Lit Green, not counting what I referred to afterwards as original recipe. That the hot wire cable that preceded the name Livewire, that ended up dropping away because people were confused between Livewire and AudioQuest. Because it's more interesting. Colors are more interesting than everything being the same color. Uh, Human emotional response. Music is emotional provocation. Uh, it seems to me appropriate that all entertainment phenomena, things that you were willing to pay to do rather than have to be paid to do, work, uh, should be as uh, provocative on as many levels as are satisfying and inspiring and rewarding to 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 a human. To a human. I have to admit, I haven't really got other animals to pay for my products yet, so it's about humans. But it always is. It always is remarkable to watch pets and how they respond with music. And the cat that I had that would not walk between my Koss electrostatic loudspeakers when they were in my living room in Portland, and in 1975,
This
because
is
the
not
image
this is
was
not your
just too
average.
real.
This is not your average dodo moment where you're watching a cat or a dog walking towards a pair of electrostatic loudspeakers and go, you know.
No, it's not that one. It's more just truly being intimidated by the fact that there was sound in the right place
Ah,
where there was supposed to
and
be
they're
any
and they're
sound.
and they're turning their
Uh,
heads, wagging their tails, or doing whatever it comes naturally in that. Oh, that's good.
so names and colors and pictures are a whole lot more interesting. Uh, that's just, I don't know, human. I guess you could say it's somebody in a professional advertising might look at what we do, and I think they would say that this is really pretty well done, and this is why you do it, and this is why it works, and they'd be talking in intellectual terms that would not be inappropriate. Uh, but that's not where it comes from. It, along with my history as a cable designer, comes organically from just noticing things, and oh, this worked. Oh, this got a response. Oh, when I changed the color of a cable from brown to burgundy, sales tripled. Well, partly I forgot the name of the experiment about lighting. You make a change and you increase the lighting, you lower the lighting, people are more productive. Either way, not because it's about the ideal lighting, but because the experiment itself is the contamination that has people paying attention. So they're more productive with every change. You can easily get suckered into that. But anyway, I noticed early on that people cared about the things that touch them and the way they live, as simple as color.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's pretty
and then
impressive.
color names started becoming more interesting, like indigo and midnight and cobalt. Uh, and then uh, it's just an organic evolution into families.
So some years ago, we received our inventory of cables in the mid-tier category, and each one of them came with this charming little black battery pack on it. And the letters DBS were emblazoned on it. And it took me probably up to 6 months to try to ingest the technology as your reps and your team came about to talk us through it. But it wasn't until a few months into that, while still trying to grasp the knowledge of it, I had to set up some systems in our now listening rooms at that time. And I fired up a non-DBS cable, um, and then a cable that basically had the same technology. I think it was the King Cobra that I'm talking about, and it had King Cobra followed by the entry level of the first of the DBS series cables. Pop that in, listen to an A/B comparison, and I was instantly shocked. And to this day, it's hard for me to give adjectives or to give my organic sense of why the DBS works.
Well,
What was
its
going on? What was
origins.
going on in your mind or in your team's mind to get this product off to market, and why has it been such a runaway hit for us?
Well, the last part of that, if it's a runaway hit, I'd say it's a combination of the fact that it is effective if you're with your eyes closed. You hear the difference. It does carry a little extra marketing advantage that it's visible, because most everything else that I talk about for what's going on inside a cable is not visible. DBS happens to be visible and therefore becomes sort of a signature of, oh, I've arrived at a quality of cable where it's worth spending the money to do this thing that reduces distortion, that causes less harm. But I was a history major. I'm not an engineer. I was going to correct that earlier reference you made. I've learned a little along the way. Not as much as, say, Garth Powell, who would define himself as a musician who happens to do engineering, but he qualifies as a full-on engineer. I don't. And I was embarrassed for decades, proud and embarrassed for decades, that how come a history major with no formal education? I mean, I took physics, I took psychology, I took sociology, I took a lot of things in college, but I didn't take any electrical engineering. How come I'm designing cables that, to my way of thinking and to many others, were better than what came out of the minds of many competent engineers, which I see as the misapplication of what they knew. And that's what you hear every time some engineer wants to argue with you about how there's no skin-affected audio frequencies. Well, of course there's skin-affected audio frequencies. The dumbest engineer knows that. They're just they're being sloppy with language and saying that there's no relevant loss of amplitude at audio frequencies in the lengths that I use in my home due to skin effect. And they're right. They're dead right. But that's a misapplication of their knowledge. They're thinking in radio frequency terms and how difficult it is to get power to an FM antenna, or that, say, Dish, they lose 20 dB. They lose 99% of the energy from the amplifier inside the building to the satellite dish outside. Those are big issues. And if that's what you've been taught and that's what you think about, then audio looks like, well, there's no problem. But we have a different problem with phase shift. Anyway, I was very aware, and as any half-decent person calling themselves an audiophile should be, I phrased that incorrectly. But if you leave your amplifier turned on, it sounds better. If you leave your amplifier turned on, your speaker cable sounds better. Your speaker sounds better because there are a lot of big capacitors in a loudspeaker. They have no charge on them except when they're playing music. The quiescent current from an amplifier, as long as it's left turned on, even though it's not playing music, is putting a field on all the capacitors all the way on down to the loudspeaker. So this sort of basic given that keeping a charge on all forms of capacitor, circuit board traces are on a circuit board. That's next to a dielectric. It interacts, it absorbs energy, releases that energy later, out of phase, different frequency, well, a sort of dielectric noise, in the sense that anytime you have energy that you wish wasn't there, that's noise. Noise is two different things. Noise is tape hiss and scratches on a record, but it's not. That's not noise. That's information being well reproduced that we wish wasn't there. And so we use noise as a pejorative about sound. The other version of noise is it's noise that has nothing to do with the signal. It's not itself signal, but it is parasitic, or uh, it is riding on the signal, or it's completely unrelated. Uh, just because you don't hear breaker over your audio system doesn't mean that that energy is not being picked up on every wire and chassis in your system. It's just not being demodulated into something that's meaningful to our consciousness, but it's there. Our ears pick up noise that has no meaning. This comes to the dielectrical bias system. I'm actually getting there.
Hmm.
The, when an insulation absorbs energy, and then releases that energy slightly out at the wrong time, and even at a different frequency. And it's not actually random. It is related to the material that the energy is going into, and related to the input of energy that came from signal. But what comes back out is no longer the signal, and no longer has meaning, and you cannot hear it. But if you compared, say, I think Jaguar would have been the cable that you were probably referring to as being the lowest level of DBS, because
Yes,
Jaguar,
that's
Panther,
correct. So
Cheetah were
King Cobra to Jaguar at that time. That's correct.
the original series. Uh, you hear the same cable, and to today, say with HDMI, vodka and coffee are the identical cable with and without DBS. That's the digital domain, and you don't hear noise in the same way, but noise causes degradation in a not incomparable manner.
And I think
The,
that brings up an interesting point here, because you mentioned the tape hiss and all the other natural occurrences that are happening, and that you don't want that to be taken away from the sound quality when it's passing through. One of the great things
well, I don't say I don't want it to be taken away, but
yeah, no, I
the
understand.
price of taking it away is not always worth it.
Correct. I think one of the things that has me always loving what DBS does goes to the fact that when I am listening to some serious source material, whether it's a disc, whether it is a streaming piece at high resolution rates, is that when DBS is employed, the first thing I'm realizing is that there's much more information retrieval that I had not thought before, much more layering to instrumentation, as it really was intended to be when the recording engineer was really focused on it. And I thought, wow, that's a gift, when you look at how DBS does things.
Well, you used, and it's, I don't mean this as a correction, because what you said is absolutely correct, but you did use the positive of more information. But there's not more information, there's less masking. Uh, and you've been exposed to some of Garth Powell's, I now actually have a real engineer working for me, and the combination of how I approach design and his knowledge is a fantastic, amazing thing I could never have approached on my own. As I was saying earlier, I'm kind of proud of how far I did get as a feeling my way around in the dark, and that actually highlighted the ingredients that Garth then picked up, understood, and has applied better than I could ever possibly have applied them, including the dielectric bias system. But what I was talking about with noise is that if you compare the exact same cable with and without DBS, analog, because the digital, like I say, is an in-between layer of processing, the benefit is not that different, but the direct process of describing noise as being an auditory phenomenon. When people hear the same cable with DBS, and it takes like 2 weeks for a DBS pack to have been on a cable for this to be true, which is just like you turn on your new amplifier. The better the new amp is, in some ways, the worse it sounds the first 2 weeks, because it doesn't have any generic smearing that covers over how obnoxious the sound is of dielectric that's not been formed yet. That sort of constipated quality where the bass is tight, but there's no flow. The upper mid-range is kind of projected. You notice things, but they're irritating. It takes a couple of weeks for capacitors to form. And you unplug the product. It doesn't go all the way back to exactly the same as new, but it more or less goes 2 weeks later, it's new again, and the amp sounds lousy. That's one of the challenges with tubes and Class A amplifiers is when do you leave them on because they sound better, and when do you turn them off? But the most common language we get, I always say I don't want to tell people what language they should use, but the most common we get is, the background is so much blacker, music is coming from nowhere, which to me is exactly what you were referring to.
Mm-hmm.
The noise that we cannot hear as an intellectual phenomenon, I hear that noise. Nevertheless, the removal of it, we know remarkably well that it's like removing noise, and we now have that blacker background. but it wasn't a white background before. It's a fascinating interplay at the edge of consciousness that because that energy is picked up by the ear, by the microphone, turned into an electrical signal and fed to the brain, but the brain doesn't know what to do with it. There's no pattern recognition. And not even interpolation, the other incredibly important part of human cognition that should be held up, that many people should know about. Interpolation is about pattern recognition. But the point is there are no handles, and the intellectual construct that the brain creates that milliseconds later is handed to our consciousness, that is a sound that we think we hear, it's not in real time. It's an intellectual construct based on memories and pattern recognition, making sense out of electrical provocation having come from our ears. And as that energy gets distorted, as that signal gets distorted, the first layer is something that I refer to as being like a funhouse mirror. You can recognize yourself in a funhouse mirror, but you're wrong. But you can still say, oh, that's me and that's my friend. You still have recognizable, oh, that's a violin, that's a piano. At some point, the data is too corrupt, and the quick decision made by our analog cheating computer is, I'm going to ignore this. I can't make anything out of it. I'm not going to give it to consciousness as a phenomenon that the human is going to be conscious of. It's not like they made a decision in the sense of it being another consciousness making that decision, but that's just the natural process. We're biased. We're not cameras. We're not microphones making perfect recordings. We are biological creatures who only take in a minority of the information that our senses pick up and are able to process them into something that can be handed to our consciousness.
Sure.
In the visual domain, people are a lot more familiar with the idea of cheating and compression and what you can get away with. We're biased towards noticing change. So all animals, basically, for survival, are biased towards noticing change. You can do certain types of damage to a visual or an audio signal and have it be, if you point it out, maybe you can see it, maybe you can't even point it out to ever see it. But we remove it from our consciousness because it's a constant. We've learned how to see through it. You move to a new house, you set up your hi-fi system, and you say, I can't live here. This room's no good. And you do, one approach is you do your best to try to tame the room. But even if you did nothing to it, most of the time, 2 weeks later, you're listening to your music. The first arrival information from the speaker is always more important anyway. And the brain does an astonishingly good job of adapting. You don't feel your clothes when you're wearing them. You do feel them as you're putting them on. You would feel change. You don't feel constants. The same in the audio domain, the same in the visual domain. So DBS was a phenomenon that I only addressed by leaving my amplifier turned on. But Richard Vandersteen gets the credit for being the catalyst that provoked me to invent the invention of dielectric bias system. He described to me a system for biasing a coaxial cable. It turns out maybe many people had invented this, but it also is a patent that Damian Martin filed that he later sold to Monster Cable. But nobody ever made a product according to this because it's one step forward and two steps backwards. But it was putting a bias signal on a coaxial cable and putting blocking caps on each end so that the DC signal wouldn't fry your system. Well, reducing the amount of distortion caused by the capacitor that is a cable is a long capacitor, reducing that while putting two new caps on the end, that's the one step forward, two steps backwards. So I never made that cable, and despite Monster having paid Damian Martin for the patent, they never made such a cable either. But Richard pushed me for like 2 years. Richard's very insistent. You know Richard, fantastic guy. And he kept pushing me about dielectric bias. I should bias my cables. And I agreed. I would if I could. And then, I don't know, two years later, I had one of those little things, the kind of thing that comes to you in the shower. Some of my other patents did come to me in the shower, not this one. And I realized that, well, as long as at least one of the field elements for having the electrostatic field on the dielectric was not itself in the signal path, then the other one could be. And that by putting an additional conductor in the center of my cables and using the shield as the other side of electrostatic field, I would put all the insulation in the cable inside of a permanent electrostatic field that would, again, it takes 2 weeks, but would form the dielectric better than it was ever formed by playing music all your life and for another 1,000 years after that.
And
Uh,
it is quite possibly one of the greatest achievements in that cable line's long history. The fact that it's been
well, no, things like Garth having brought zero tech to our cable design, I put way ahead of
okay.
my having invented GBS.
Allow me to bow to you though, then for a little bit of that about that action. So along with your development of the cables and along with the building of your company, you had a record label for a long time. That was wonderful. Great titles, great history there. But also, you dabbled a little bit with electronics. You had introduced one of your first branded cartridges, many years ago. But we fast forward to the past couple of years, and suddenly Lyra comes into the picture. What prompted you to bring Lyra into the AudioQuest fold, as far as having it as part of your brand mix?
You give me too much credit. It wasn't my idea. And by that, I don't. I met Stig and Jonathan and Mishima, who are Lyra, uh, in 1987. First time that I was in Japan. Uh, my distributor had a fellow from the UK who was the sales manager, who was who were good friends with a variety of the people that I still very much enjoy meeting in Japan today, like Miura-san, who's now the #1 reviewer in Japan, was not even a reviewer yet in those days, involved with different materials for CD beside polycarbonate. Many of people in the industry have long history. Anyway, I met Stig and Jonathan, and while we were walking around Tokyo, Jonathan and I started discussing a potential AudioQuest cartridge, which became the AudioQuest 7000, and how I'd already been in the cartridge business for 4 years since bringing out the 404, which was the first high output moving coil that changed the initial perception that high output moving coils were a defective concept. I definitely have Harry Pearson to thank for blessing that cartridge and making it one of the best-selling cartridges in the world. But it came about as a result of my previous Japanese distributor being owned by the same company that owned XL, and sending me samples and mine saying, "Well, that's really good. Could you do this? Could you do this?" I was not a designer, but I was a provocateur, and we made some really great cartridges before I met Stig and Jonathan. But then my relationship with the people that are today called Lyra, they were making the Tsuragi cartridge for Spectral. The Spectral cartridge for Spectral. They were making the same cartridge with a different body and calling it Tsuragi and selling it on their own behalf. The company shell was called Scantech. If anything, they were more interested in electronics, which they sold under the Connoisseur name, hand-built, really extreme high-end electronics. So over the years, I had the relationship with the AudioQuest 7000 going through 3 different generations, and Scantech became a more and more competent cartridge company, and they had their own distribution around the world. They were, without telling tales out of school, extremely unhappy with their U.S. distribution, and they asked me if I would be the U.S. distributor. And I said yes.
I have to say that's been a great marriage, because I've had a long-standing relationship, and knowing Lyra, having mounted a number of their cartridges from their ever-popular Helicon to the latest versions that are on the market right now. And when we had a chance to enjoy some sales training with Stig and Jonathan, you really got to know what was going on in terms of the technology to deliver such a rich sound. It's a highly unusual design, but at the same token, pardon my language, it kicks ass, musically speaking. So it's really a spectacular cartridge to want
It
people
it
to own.
it sure does, and I'm sorry to say I have not seen. It's on my hot list to watch that really that conference call or whatever session that you had with Stig and Jonathan, because Jonathan is one of the, for me, extraordinary, most rewarding people in the world. When we get together in Tokyo, we always set aside at least a day, and Stig is very patient and puts up with hours and hours, 4 hours before lunch, 4 hours after lunch, of Jonathan and I just discussing everything in the world. And Stig, who's the business side of the company and an intelligent, fabulous person himself, but in this case, he's the passenger who's also getting work done on his phone, while Jonathan and I just play. And that is the key to me of why Jonathan's cartridges are so extraordinary, is this combination of being a perfectionist, but being absolutely open and inquisitive, permanently inquisitive, insatiable thirst, as I call it, the people who can never know enough. And the more they know, the more they realize the less they actually know of what they want to know. That's wisdom. That's an old idea. I mean, Mark Twain talking about, how dumb his father was when he was 18, how smart his father had become by the time he was 25. As you learn to respect, knowledge and the limitations. And you have to have a little hubris. You have to have enough confidence in what you do know. Otherwise, you're just stuck learning forever and you never make anything.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Believe it or not, we only have a few moments left, but not before I want to say thank you very much for joining us, and certainly to our viewers out there in Facebook Live. If you missed any of this, it's yours to enjoy for a little while. We'll also be rebroadcasting this in 24 hours on our YouTube channel, so you can enjoy Bill's thoughts and talk, and me grinning profusely. But one last question, and this has to do with AudioQuest, the company, going forward. As everyone knows, earlier this year, Sandy Gross of GoldenEar Technology got into cahoots with you, and you guys now own that brand. It marks your first foray into speakers, but that also says, from a crystal ball standpoint, what's ahead for AudioQuest. Is there anything you can sort of give us a little bit of a few moments to say, we're going to do this, we're going to make things even more interesting for us as we go into 2021 and beyond?
Taking over GoldenEar has if I was bored, which I wasn't, that opens a lot of doors. Sandy would absolutely be running GoldenEar today if his partners hadn't wanted to resign. And Sandy didn't want to buy the company on his own because he'd always had partners and they were the business people. So that was a remarkable opportunity that is the exception to the rule that I believe in starting from scratch, that I'm not interested. It doesn't mean it'll never happen again, but it was a very unusual combination of circumstances with what Sandy had done, again, not totally on his own, but he's highly visible as the driver and the legend who has earned being synonymous with GoldenEar and Def Tech and partner in Poke. But nothing is ever finished. As I said, it's a work in progress, and as fantastic as the GoldenEar speakers are, thinking 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line about the kinds of ingredients that Garth Powell can help bring and some of my own priorities, there will be evolution, but not because anything's broken. When people have asked me for ages, every time I bring out something new about cables, people would say, "Wow, this is fantastic. What's next?" It's like, well, if I knew, I would have already done it. But that doesn't mean there will be no new ideas. It means it's an organic phenomenon that happens through time, and everything is going to change. Almost nothing, 10 years later, almost everything's going to have some significant modification to it because we only know this much.
Sure.
Humans don't know much. Type 4 did not change from 1995 until it was discontinued this year in favor of Type 5, which is the same design with a little better material.
Right.
That's unusual. That's the exception. There really was a balance there. In fact, even Robin Hood today has this balance of the same 4 conductors in 2 different sizes. That really was a remarkable cornerstone. What was the question? GoldenEar?
And on that note, Bill Lowe, Thank you so much. This has been a very, very enlightening, very fun, very thoughtful conversation. I do wish you well. And as always, if there's anything you need, you know what to do. I'm just a phone call away, pal. Anything you need, we'll take good care of you, as we will all of our customers who've been watching and our friends on Facebook Live. Coming up tomorrow, Ivana Manley joins us for what will be a great hour of conversation from her. The fabulous owner of Manly Labs, and her life story will come to us for a good chunk of time. So we're looking forward to that chat. Bill, thank you again. If you folks have additional information or questions on the products that we've talked about, or would like to know more about AudioQuest, please visit our website at musicdirect.com and click on the brand page, and you'll see AudioQuest as the many manufacturers that we have, and our complete selection of accessories and cables and power products to boot. And for all of us at Music Direct, thank you so much for watching. It's been a pleasure being here for you, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow for Ivana Manley. Till then, take care.